Okay, this is Natives of Alaska, and this is the section on the Aleut or the Unangan people of the Aleutian Islands. So the Aleutian chain forms the westward arm of the Alaska Peninsula, and the islands are actually crests of submarine volcanoes. And this is always the little insert you're going to see in the map because in terms of symmetry, it doesn't always, or it never fits on maps of Alaska, so they usually have to do a little insert. And most of the islands are crests of submarine volcanoes. So there are a lot of volcanoes in this area. And on a clear day, the view is great, but this area is known for a lot of fog and a lot of storms, and this did play into the history of contact. So the weather is maritime, which is characterized by violent storms, high winds, dense fog, little snow, no permafrost. So if you live on an island, what's your main focus of adaptation? How do you get your food and livelihood? Well, it's by a marine environment. So they had to be sailors. They had to live off the sea. So who are the Aleuts? They call themselves Unangan, which means we the people. They believe that they lived in the Aleutian Islands since time began. And you might want to remember this phrase, there used to be many, now they are few. And so during our whole time talking about the Aleutians and the Aleuts, we're going to refer to them as the Aleuts, but understand that they do not call themselves that, and they never did. Okay, but we're going to talk about how the history of contact really changed their lives forever. And no one's really sure exactly where the term Aleut came from. The belief is that it probably came from what the Russians called them, and the people on the farthest islands were referred to as Aleut or Aleut, what they called themselves, and so that might be how the Russians adopted these names, or it could have been from kind of like pig Russian where they're trying to communicate and they would say Alik Uala, which means what is it, which was used a lot by the Russians. But we think the first explanation is more correct. But of course, we have no way of knowing. So one of the best early authorities on the Aleut was William Laughlin. William Laughlin, I believe, died in the 1980s. All of his papers are at the University of Alaska Anchorage Library archives. And he wrote a very famous book called Aleuts, Survivors of the Bering Land Bridge. So this has become the, the hallmark book on the Aleuts. He did his field work not only in the 1930s, but in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. And so in the first part of his book, he actually described the physical attributes of the Aleuts using physical anthropology. And one thing he noticed was that the babies sometimes had what was called a sacral spot at birth. These were the birthmarks, also known as Mongolian spots. They do go away. And the other thing that he found was he looked at blood groups. And what he realized was that the Aleuts and the Eskimos were more similar to each other by blood group, because when he did this, we didn't have genetics or anything, than they were to the other Indians in North and South America. And so part of this work on blood groups factored into how the theory of Beringia came about. But again, they used all kinds of hard science for it. And then the other thing is that what the Aleuts had that was shared with Eskimos was high rates of spina bifida and neural arches. So again, these separate the Aleuts and the Eskimos from the Indians. And you can see little pictures of these neural arches. So, of course, the Aleutians make up a big part of the puzzle about how the Americas were populated. And if you remember the three migration theory that you'll hear, or that we talked about when we talked about archaeology, what migration group was the Aleuts? Well, if you think about it, they were the third migration, right? The last one that consisted of the Eska Aleuts. And again, we think that they came by sea, not by land. So what we're going to talk about while we talk about the Aleutians and the Aleuts is the great population changes over time. So I want you to start thinking about, why did we see these populations? And we're going to talk about it. Or why did we see these population declines? So at the time of contact, as best they could put together, there were about 16,000 Aleuts. After the first 10 years of Russian occupation, there was a 50% reduction. You might want to remember this and think about why as we go through the lectures. After 50 years of Russian occupation, the population went down to 1,600. So again, you need to think about what could be attributed to this. And we know prior to contact that they had a large and stable population base. People lived to be over 100, and they had very low infant mortality. The other thing that you need to keep in mind is that the Aleuts had not only a lot of material achievements, material culture achievements, but also intellectual achievements. So again, material culture, that consists of things you can hold, what you eat, what you wear, okay, what you move around in. They had kayaks. We're going to talk about their houses. And you need to know the difference between what material culture is and what intellectual culture is. So in terms of intellectual culture, we know that they were experts at human anatomy. You have to be if you practice mummification. We're going to talk about the mummification that they did. We're going to talk about their art styles, and we're going to talk about their elaborate oral culture. They had words for very small arteries. They had words for all the different parts of the bones, almost like we do now. So they were very advanced in a lot of ways. And they used the sea extensively. So they lived on an island, or they lived on many islands, excuse me, that didn't have a lot of trees. So what do you use for building if you don't have trees and you live on an island? Well, they used driftwood, and they also used whale bones.